Michael Johnson was a man who lived in a quiet neighborhood in Virginia with his wife Michelle and their two children, Daniel and Grace, and to anyone passing by he looked like a simple family man who carried a little extra weight and liked to spend weekends fixing the yard or grilling food with neighbors. But what no one around him knew was that Michael had once been a Delta Force commander, a man who had led missions in silence, faced dangers that most people could not imagine, and returned home carrying secrets he never shared because he believed those years belonged to the past, and now he only wanted peace, safety, and the love of his family. Yet life has a way of testing people at the moments they least expect, and one cool autumn evening that test arrived when flashing police lights filled the street outside the Johnson home, catching the attention of neighbors who rushed to their windows in confusion, whispering and pointing as patrol cars lined up in front of the house like something out of a crime show. And Michelle, who had been cooking dinner, froze as she saw uniformed officers stepping onto their lawn, ordering her to come outside and answer questions about a matter she had never even heard of, and fear rippled through her chest because Daniel and Grace were still at the table, looking at her with wide and uncertain eyes, asking what was happening, and she forced herself to stay calm, telling them softly to remain inside, before she stepped onto the porch. Her hands trembling even as she tried to appear steady, and the officers began to accuse her of things that made no sense, talking about stolen items and a supposed link to a crime that had nothing to do with their family, and as neighbors gathered in small groups, some began to doubt while others shook their heads, for rumors always moved faster than truth, and the air felt heavier with every second as Michelle tried to explain, saying they had made a mistake, but the officers only pressed harder, their tone sharp, their questions relentless, until Daniel and Grace could no longer hold themselves back and peeked from the window, their young hearts tight with fear as they watched strangers treat their mother like a suspect. And then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke through the tension, for Michael had returned home from work, carrying the ordinary exhaustion of a long day, expecting nothing more than a warm meal with his family, but instead finding a wall of patrol cars and the sight of his wife standing on the porch surrounded by officers, and in that moment his body reacted before his mind could catch up, the instincts of his old life rising from deep inside him, instincts he had buried for years, and as his eyes scanned the scene he saw everything the way a commander once did, reading body language, positions, threats, and weaknesses, but he forced those instincts down, reminding himself that this was not a battlefield, that this was his home. And he stepped forward slowly, his calm but commanding voice asking what the problem was, and the officers turned to him with suspicion, their expressions sharp as though they were expecting a fight, but Michael only stood tall, placing himself between his wife and the officers, his large frame a silent shield, his steady eyes filled with a kind of authority that could not be ignored, and he demanded fairness, demanded respect, and though the officers continued to insist they had evidence, he did not falter, his voice never rising but never bending either, and the neighbors who were watching from across the street began to whisper again, realizing there was something different about the way Michael carried himself, something stronger than what they had thought, for he was not simply a man coming home to chaos, he was a man who had seen worse and yet remained unshaken, and as the minutes stretched into an hour, tension hanging thick in the air, Michael knew deep inside that this was not a mistake that would go away easily, that someone somewhere had drawn his family into something larger, and though the officers had no idea who they were really standing in front of, he knew the truth, he knew that if pushed too far he could end the night in a way that none of them were prepared for, but he also knew his children were watching from the window, their small faces pressed against the glass, their trust in him unspoken but powerful, and that trust reminded him of his duty now. Not as a soldier but as a father and husband, and so he chose patience, he chose restraint, yet a storm was already forming inside him, a storm he could not ignore forever, because the safety of his family was on the line, and though the officers eventually stepped back that night, leaving with more questions than answers, Michael stood on his porch with Michelle's hand in his, Daniel and Grace holding onto his arms, and he felt the weight of what was coming, the sense that the peace he had fought so hard to build was slipping away, and as he looked into the dark street, watching the last patrol car disappear, he knew that the days ahead would test not only his strength but the very soul of his family, and while the world still saw him as just another man, he understood that the time might soon come when his hidden past would no longer remain hidden, and those who had underestimated him would discover that he was not a man to be cornered, for behind the quiet smile and ordinary life was a warrior who had led men through fire and shadows, a commander whose strength could not be measured by appearance but by the unbreakable resolve within, and as the autumn night grew colder and the family finally stepped back inside their home, the silence between them was heavy, filled with fear and questions, but also with an unspoken trust in Michael, and in that silence the first chapter of their trial had begun. The next morning came with a strange silence in the Johnson household, for although the sky outside was clear and the sun shone gently through the windows, the weight of the previous night still hung in the air like a heavy shadow, and Michelle found herself moving slower than usual, her hands trembling slightly as she packed lunch for the children, while Daniel and Grace, usually cheerful before school, sat quietly at the table, their eyes still wide from what they had witnessed, and Michael, who had always been the calm anchor of the family, sat in his chair with a thoughtful stillness, his strong hands folded as if he were holding back a storm inside, and though he did not want his family to carry fear, he also knew they could not pretend nothing had happened, for the flashing lights, the accusations, and the way the officers had treated them were burned into their minds, and so, as his children prepared to leave for school, Michael knelt down to their level, placing his large hands on their shoulders, speaking in a low steady voice that promised safety, telling them to focus on their day, to trust that he would take care of everything, and though his words gave some comfort, their young hearts still carried unease, and Michelle, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt her own heart ache, wondering why their family had been dragged into the storm when all they had ever wanted was a peaceful life, but Michael had no doubts, for deep inside he knew such things did not happen by accident. Someone had pointed fingers at them, someone had made a choice, and if he wanted to protect his family he had to understand who and why, and so after walking the children to the bus stop and watching them disappear safely down the street, he returned inside and spoke quietly to Michelle, his voice calm but filled with certainty, telling her that their lives were about to change, and she looked at him with worry, asking what he meant, and for the first time in years Michael allowed a small glimpse of his past to show, explaining that he had once been part of something much larger than what anyone in their neighborhood could imagine, that he had lived in places where suspicion and threats arrived suddenly and without warning, and that the way the officers had acted last night was not just the work of chance but part of a larger design, and while Michelle listened with wide eyes, trying to process the truth, he reassured her that he had not shared these things before because he wanted to protect her and the children from the weight of it all, but now he had no choice, now the past was knocking at their door, and as he spoke his words were not of fear but of determination, promising her that he would not allow anyone to break their family apart, and Michelle, though afraid, felt her heart steady as she looked into his eyes, seeing not only the man she loved but the quiet strength that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, and she believed him, yet she also knew this meant their days of simple peace were over, and as the hours passed that day Michael began to notice things he had ignored before, a car parked too long at the corner of their street, a man pretending to jog while glancing at their home more than once, and though most neighbors might not have seen anything unusual, Michael's trained eyes recognized the signs, for he had been both the watcher and the watched in his years of service, and he understood when surveillance was being done, and a slow realization dawned on him that his family was under watch, that the incident with the police was only the first step in something more dangerous, and though his blood burned with the urge to confront it directly, he reminded himself that his greatest duty now was to shield Daniel, Grace, and Michelle from fear, to make their home feel safe even as the world outside grew darker, and so he carried himself as usual, mowing the lawn, greeting neighbors, even laughing when someone cracked a joke, but beneath that calm surface he was planning, thinking, measuring every detail, because a commander never forgets how to prepare, and at night, when the children were asleep, he sat with Michelle at the kitchen table, laying out a map of their town, marking the unusual patterns he had seen, explaining quietly but firmly that if something happened they would need to be ready, and Michelle listened carefully, her fear now tempered by trust, because she could see he was not only her husband but a protector shaped by years of discipline, and while she worried for the danger, she also felt a strange comfort knowing he was not helpless, that he carried a strength most men could never imagine, and over the next few days the tension grew, more officers circling the neighborhood with excuses of patrol, more unfamiliar cars appearing, more whispers from neighbors who did not understand, and Daniel and Grace began to sense it too, asking why everyone seemed to look at them differently, and Michael, though his heart ached, told them gently that sometimes people believe things that are not true, but the truth always wins if you stay strong, and those words stayed with them, giving them courage even when fear pressed close, and one evening, just as the family sat down for dinner, there came a sudden knock at the door, heavy and commanding, and when Michael opened it he found not just officers but men in plain clothes who carried themselves differently, men who did not smile, men who studied him with the same sharp eyes he once saw on soldiers in foreign lands, and they began to ask questions not about crimes in the neighborhood but about him, about where he had been, about what he had done before, and though they pretended their tone was casual, Michael knew it was not, for they had discovered pieces of his past, and now the truth he had kept hidden for so long was slowly coming to light, and as he answered with calm precision, offering nothing more than what was necessary, Michelle stood beside him, holding her breath, realizing that whatever was unfolding was far beyond what she had imagined, and when the men finally left, leaving behind only a card with a number to call, Michael closed the door and looked at his family, and in that moment he knew the storm was no longer coming, it was already here, and the life they once knew had changed forever, and yet, within that storm, his resolve hardened, for he would not allow anyone to break them, and the world would soon learn that beneath the quiet face of an ordinary man lived a commander who had never forgotten how to fight for what mattered most. The days that followed were heavy with tension, for though the Johnson family tried to live as normally as possible, each morning began with the same uneasy glance through the window to see if the unfamiliar cars were still parked on the corner, each afternoon carried the same hushed conversations from neighbors who no longer waved with the same warmth, and each night ended with the children asking questions that Michael and Michelle could only answer with reassurances rather than explanations. Because the truth was too complicated for young hearts to understand, and though Michael remained outwardly calm, inside his mind worked like a clock, observing patterns, connecting dots, and quietly preparing for the moment when silence would no longer protect them, and on one particular evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the street in shades of orange and gold, Michael walked outside to fetch the mail, noticing again the same car idling too long, and when his eyes met the driver's, for the briefest second, he saw no friendliness there, only the cold distance of someone assigned to watch, and though his instincts screamed to confront, he turned away, holding the letters with a steady hand, for he knew patience was his weapon now, and inside the house Michelle was sitting at the kitchen table with worry on her face, telling him softly that she could not keep living in fear, that the children deserved to laugh without glancing over their shoulders, and Michael, placing a reassuring hand over hers, promised her again that he would not let anything happen, but even as he said the words he felt the pressure mounting, because the knock on the door would come sooner or later, and he would need to be ready, and that night as Daniel and Grace slept, Michael opened an old wooden chest in the attic, a chest covered in dust, a chest he had not touched in years, and inside lay fragments of a life he had buried, patches, photographs, and neatly folded uniforms, along with a small black book filled with coded notes, reminders from missions that had once taken him to the edge of the world, and though his heart tightened as memories flooded back, he reminded himself that the man he once was still lived within him, and if his family was to survive what was coming, he had to awaken that man again, and as he carefully closed the chest he heard Michelle's footsteps behind him, her voice soft but steady as she asked if this was the life he had lived, and he nodded, telling her that he had kept it hidden not because he was ashamed but because he wanted to protect her from the weight of it, and though fear glimmered in her eyes, she also felt pride, for she realized that the man she had married was not only her husband but someone who had once carried the burden of an entire nation, and the next morning the knock finally came, louder than before, shaking the walls as 3 black vehicles lined the street, and men in suits and plain clothes stepped out. Their eyes sharp, their steps confident, and when Michael opened the door they introduced themselves not as ordinary officers but as investigators from a special branch, demanding to speak to him privately, and though Michelle wanted to refuse, Michael calmly agreed, stepping outside, standing tall on the porch as his children watched from the window again, and the men asked him pointed questions about his past, about missions he had been part of, about names he had not heard in years, and Michael answered little, reminding them that his service had been classified and his records sealed, but they pressed harder, suggesting that someone like him could not simply disappear into a quiet life, that perhaps he had connections, that perhaps his family's safety was not as pure as it seemed, and with each word Michael felt the trap tightening, yet he refused to break, his calm expression hiding the storm inside, until finally one of the men leaned closer, warning him that if he did not cooperate, his family could face consequences, and in that instant Michael's eyes hardened, a flicker of the commander within flashing through, his voice steady but carrying an edge of steel as he told them that his family was off limits, that he had given his life once for his country and would not allow anyone, uniform or not, to harm his wife or children, and though the men said little after that, he knew the message was clear, and when they left, the weight of their threat remained heavy. And inside the house Michelle clutched his arm, asking what would happen next, and Michael simply said they were trying to pull him back into a world he had left, that someone out there still remembered his name, and perhaps even feared what he could do, and over the next few days his mind worked tirelessly, piecing together why the police had first shown up, why neighbors were whispering, why strange men were now at his door, and he realized there was something deeper, perhaps a case, perhaps an operation, where someone had chosen his family as leverage, and that meant danger was no longer far away but already at their doorstep, and so he began to train quietly, rising before dawn to run while the town slept, using old routines that his body remembered even after years of rest, practicing discipline in silence, sharpening not only his strength but his focus, and though Michelle worried, she supported him, helping in small ways, watching the children more closely, and reminding him that they stood together, and Daniel and Grace, sensing the changes, began to draw closer to their parents, their innocence slowly touched by the tension but their trust in their father growing stronger, and one night, as Michael tucked them into bed, Daniel asked if everything would be okay, and Michael, kneeling by his son's side, promised him that no matter what happened, he would never let anything hurt them, and Grace, holding her father's hand, whispered that she believed him, and in that moment Michael's heart swelled with both love and sorrow, because he knew a storm was coming that his children could not yet understand, but he also knew that his greatest strength came from them, and as he stood later that night looking out the window at the dark street, the parked cars, the shifting shadows, he realized that the time for silence was ending, that soon he would have to step forward and show the world the man he had once been, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the sake of his family. And with that thought burning in his heart, Michael Johnson prepared himself for the inevitable confrontation that was drawing closer with each passing hour. The week that followed felt like a battlefield without bullets, for although there was no open violence, every moment carried the tension of being watched, and Michael could feel it in the way the same car circled their block too often, in the way the mail sometimes arrived late with envelopes that looked tampered, in the way Daniel and Grace returned from school saying that other kids whispered things about their family as though rumors had spread beyond their street, and Michelle tried to keep the home steady with warm meals and soft words, but the worry in her eyes betrayed her heart, and Michael knew he could not wait for danger to arrive at his door. He had to take control before fear swallowed his family whole, and so one quiet evening after dinner, while his children worked on their homework and Michelle folded laundry, Michael stepped into the garage, pulling out an old duffel bag that had not seen the light of day for years, and inside were items he had kept not as weapons of war but as reminders of who he once was: boots that had walked through deserts and jungles, gloves that had carried comrades from fire, and a knife whose blade had been sharpened more by memory than by stone. And as he touched them he did not feel pride but a sobering sense of responsibility, because these things reminded him that survival was not about violence but about readiness, and if he was to shield his family he had to awaken the discipline that once guided him. And over the next days he began to prepare in silence, rising before dawn to run through the quiet streets, strengthening his body, sharpening his awareness. And while neighbors whispered about his sudden changes, Michael paid no mind, for his focus was on something greater, and Michelle, though fearful, understood and supported him in quiet ways, leaving water by the door after his runs, keeping the children occupied while he worked in the garage, and standing beside him with unspoken faith. And one evening, when the children were asleep, Michael finally spoke openly with her, telling her that the men who had come to their door were not ordinary investigators, that their questions carried the weight of old secrets, and that someone somewhere had pulled strings to paint their family as a target, perhaps to pressure him into returning to a life he had left, or perhaps to silence him before some truth emerged. And Michelle, holding his hand, whispered that she trusted him, that she believed he could protect them, and that faith became his anchor. And the next morning, as if to confirm his fears, two men approached him openly while he worked in the yard, men in suits who spoke with rehearsed politeness but whose eyes betrayed cold intent, and they told him that his family would be safer if he cooperated, that he still owed something for the years he had served. And though Michael kept his voice steady, inside his resolve hardened, for he understood their words for what they were. Not offers but threats. And after they left he went inside, hugging Michelle tightly, knowing that the time for quiet waiting was over. And that evening he gathered Daniel and Grace in the living room, sitting them down gently, telling them in simple words that sometimes people make mistakes about others, that sometimes people try to test a family's strength, but that what mattered most was that they stood together. And the children, though young, understood enough to nod with trust, and Daniel, trying to be brave, told his father that he believed in him, while Grace wrapped her arms around his arm, refusing to let go, and Michael felt a swell of determination rise in his chest, because their faith was his greatest weapon. And as the days passed he began to take subtle actions, noting every face that watched their home, mapping out routes through the town, setting quiet signals with Michelle in case something sudden happened, and training his children in small ways, teaching them how to stay calm, how to listen, how to follow his instructions without panic, turning lessons into games so their hearts would not carry fear, and while outwardly life looked the same, beneath the surface their family had become a fortress of trust and readiness. And one night, long after midnight, Michael was woken by the faint sound of footsteps outside, and when he looked through the window he saw shadows moving near the fence, men scanning the house as if testing its defenses, and instead of panicking he simply watched, memorizing their movements, and in that silent moment he knew with certainty that confrontation was coming, and the next day he made a quiet decision: he would no longer only wait, he would take the fight of truth into his own hands. And so while the children were at school he drove into the city, to a place where old contacts still lingered, men and women who had once served beside him, who owed him their lives as he owed them his, and though years had passed, respect among those who had walked through fire never faded. And as he sat across from an old teammate in a quiet diner, Michael explained in careful words what was happening, and the man, listening closely, nodded with understanding, confirming that whispers of operations gone wrong had resurfaced, that powerful people were trying to erase old truths, and that perhaps Michael had become a loose thread they wished to cut. And though this knowledge carried weight, Michael felt clarity, for now he understood why his family had been drawn into danger, and he knew what he had to do. He had to protect them not only with strength but with truth. And as he drove back home under the fading sun, his mind was steady, his path clear, and when he arrived Michelle met him at the door with worried eyes, asking what he had discovered, and he told her softly that the storm was close but that he was ready, that they as a family were ready, and she nodded, her fear balanced by trust. And that night, as they tucked the children into bed, Michael stood in the hallway listening to their soft laughter, feeling both the fragility and the strength of the life he had built, and he promised himself silently that no matter who came, no matter what they threatened, he would not break, for he had faced shadows before, but this time he was fighting not for missions or for medals, but for the people he loved most, and in that truth he found a power far greater than anything he had carried in the battlefield. The following days were filled with tension and preparation, for Michael knew that the moment of confrontation was drawing near, and though outwardly he carried on as a quiet father, making breakfast, helping Daniel and Grace with homework, and sharing small laughs with Michelle, inside his mind he ran through every possible scenario, every strategy, every step he could take to protect his family without causing harm to anyone unnecessarily. And the neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, as if even the town itself sensed the change, while Michael's eyes remained alert, scanning for anything unusual, noting every face, every vehicle, and every shadow. And Michelle, though anxious, stood beside him like a steadfast partner, ensuring the children remained unaware of the storm, encouraging them to play outside, to study, to live in the innocence of childhood even as danger circled unseen. And on one evening as the sun dipped behind distant hills, a familiar set of cars slowly approached their street again, men in dark suits moving with a careful precision, and Michael quietly stepped outside, feeling the cool air brush against his face, his body calm but ready. And when the men stopped in front of the house, they stepped out with the same polite but firm demeanor as before, attempting to assert authority, to question, to intimidate, but this time Michael did not hesitate. He met their gaze with unshakable strength, his voice calm but filled with command as he told them to leave his family alone, that no threat, no pressure, and no fear would dictate their lives. And though the men tried to continue, their words faltering under his resolve, they quickly realized that the man standing before them was no ordinary father, that beneath the surface of a quiet life was a man whose skills, discipline, and courage had been forged in circumstances far more dangerous than their polite warnings could convey, and as Michael's eyes narrowed, calculating, observing, remembering every lesson from the past, he subtly positioned himself to protect the house, moving with careful precision while remaining outwardly calm, and Michelle, sensing both the tension and the confidence radiating from him, took a deep breath, holding his hand for silent reassurance, while inside Daniel and Grace watched from the window, their eyes wide, sensing the intensity of the moment though they could not fully understand it, and Michael spoke softly to them from across the room, telling them to stay calm, to trust that he would take care of everything, and that simple trust gave him more power than anything else could, for in protecting their hearts he was protecting the soul of his family, and as the men finally recognized that confrontation would not yield control, they retreated, though their lingering presence reminded Michael that the danger had not vanished entirely, and with the immediate threat gone, he turned back to Michelle, and together they embraced. Briefly, sharing relief but knowing that vigilance must remain, and in the following days Michael continued to observe, always aware, always ready, while slowly the neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy, neighbors smiling again, children laughing on the streets, and yet the lessons of the storm remained in the hearts of the Johnson family, a quiet reminder that strength, courage, and love must coexist to protect what is most precious. And one afternoon, when Daniel asked his father why some people treated them unfairly, Michael knelt to his son's level and explained in simple words that sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes fear clouds judgment, and sometimes they forget to look at the truth, but that it was important to remain honest, strong, and kind, and Daniel nodded, beginning to understand, while Grace leaned into her father and whispered that she felt safe, and Michael felt a warmth rise in his chest, for this was the true victory, that his children could feel secure even after the storm, and as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the family gathered on their porch, sitting together, talking quietly, sharing small laughs, and in that moment the house no longer felt like a place under threat but a sanctuary, a home strengthened not just by walls and locks but by trust, love, and courage, and Michael reflected that the events of the past weeks had changed them all, teaching lessons that could never be forgotten, for he had learned again the value of patience, strategy, and restraint, that strength was most powerful when combined with wisdom, and that love could be a shield stronger than any weapon, and Michelle, watching him, realized that the quiet life they had dreamed of was now enriched by the depth of their survival, that their family had endured a trial that tested every fiber of their being, yet emerged closer, stronger, and more united than ever, and as the evening deepened into night, Daniel and Grace finally went to bed with smiles, clutching their blankets, while Michael and Michelle stood together on the porch, hands intertwined, looking up at the stars, feeling a quiet pride in the life they had protected, knowing that the world outside could never take away what they had built, for the bond of family was unbreakable, and Michael, with the wisdom of a warrior and the heart of a father, understood that while his past had shaped him, it was this present, this quiet victory of love, courage, and perseverance that truly defined him, and in that moment, under the calm night sky, the Johnson family felt complete, secure, and triumphant, for they had faced fear, confrontation, and uncertainty together, and emerged not just alive, but stronger, bound by trust, respect, and the enduring power of family, and as they stepped inside, Michael whispered a promise to Michelle, a silent vow to always protect them, and though the shadows of the past could return, he knew that the bond they shared, the courage they carried, and the love they nurtured would always stand against any storm, and that night, as the house settled into quiet peace, the family slept soundly, hearts unburdened, knowing that whatever challenges might come in the future, they would face them together, as a family, resilient, united, and unstoppable.